So if everyone's happy to consent to being recorded, I'm going to share a screen and get the presentation started. Okay. Okay. So everyone see that okay? Okay, well, let's get started. So my name is Richard. For those who don't know, I'm an osteopath. I'm really grateful that the Environmental Physiotherapy Associations and Philippe have been so great about letting other people participate in this. As we talked about last night, there's the different professional backgrounds, but ultimately there is the evidence. And if we're all pursuing the evidence, the professional boundaries start to fall apart. And that's a good thing, in my opinion. I'll give a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about nature therapies, specifically Shinrin Yoku, or forest bathing, as it's commonly known as. I'm going to talk about pain, depression, the intersection of that and environmental factors. I'm going to talk about some of the problems in the nature therapy research and the Shinrin Yoku research that came out of my own paper, which was published earlier this year. And then I'm going to expand that out into a lot of questions that I don't really have answers for. And those questions are going to relate to things like problems in the research, how we apply the research, and also some ecological considerations. So in terms of conflicts of interest, nothing I'm talking about today affects my income in any way, for better or worse. I'm practicing osteopath. I am a member of a couple of non-governmental organizations involved in environmental restoration. So while I'm not going to be making money out of these findings, it is definitely something that I believe very strong, believe in a lot, and it is a big part of my life. Before becoming an osteopath, I qualified in natural science, and I had worked in the environmental field for quite some time in a variety of consultancy roles. So while a lot of people that I've met and discussed, had conversations with through the EPA are coming from a physical or physiotherapy background, looking to how do we integrate environmental considerations or issues into the profession, into the industry, how we unify health and environmental care. I've come in the wrong way, I think. I've come in from an environmental background into this world, and that affected how I think about a lot of things, because some of the contextual and environmental and sociological factors which impact health have been at the forefront of my thinking before I was ever worried about a tendinopathy or low back pain. And today I'm going to be talking primarily about nature therapy. Nature therapy is a very broad umbrella term. It refers to any sort of natural interaction that could potentially be used for healing purposes. And it encompasses quite a wide variety of things. So you've had people talking about, for instance, wilderness exploration as a form of nature therapy, going into very remote locations and exploring the actual felt sense of not having civilization around you as support, to something that is a little bit more accessible. Say it could even be bird watching. It's also incorporated in things like landscape design around hospitals, so that there are natural elements around for people who are suffering severe illnesses or undergoing palliative care. And consequently, because it has such a broad field, it's quite a multidisciplinary aspect to it. You have everyone from landscape architects to ecologists to psychologists, and hopefully now physiotherapists and osteopaths engaged with this. And while nature therapy is a sort of modern, somewhat medicalized term, the truth is that throughout human culture, there have always been structured engagements with the natural world as a means of psychospiritual healing, of dealing with suffering, of dealing with death, pain, of dealing with questions of belonging. And you can see this across, I mentioned just on this slide, Taoism, German Romanticism, Bedouin tree rituals, but it's quite remarkable. This does seem to be something that's very, very innate to humanity. And in drawing that conclusion, I don't want to pretend to have any special depth of understanding about any individual Aboriginal practices. It's extremely difficult to extrapolate out something out of its immediate cultural context, and doing so can be very, very patronizing or dismissive. And you miss out on a lot of subtleties. I don't even fully understand my own culture's historical relationship with nature. That's something that's a lifetime of exploration for me, and I'm only really scratching the surface. So I'm mentioning these different cultures just as a respectful tip of the hat. It's something worth reading about and worth engaging in, but I have no particular profound insights. Just wanted to absolutely clarify that. But one of the forms of nature therapy, as it has been integrated into Western or biomedical healthcare, a real standout example was New Zealand. And in the 1990s, doctors started doing what were called green prescriptions. So this involved developing ways of getting people out into nature when dealing with health issues, whether that was obesity or depression or diabetes. So the green prescriptions could look like structured exercise, but in a very natural environment, say along a coastal walk or a forest walk or cycling in a specific environment. And it was quite ahead of its time insofar as engagement of healthcare systems with nature therapies. There's also some wonderful work that's being done by and for Maori groups in New Zealand, where they're recreating some of the traditional rites of passage in regards to nature engagement as a therapeutic modality for Maori teenagers. And of course, as often happens in colonized areas of the world, there are a huge number of complex psychosocial issues that are going on there. As I mentioned earlier, this is a multidisciplinary field, and as a result, we have a growing body of data, publications, and many of the people involved in this research will be speaking over the course of this festival. There is something we need to recognize here. When we're talking about nature as a potentially therapeutic modality, we do have to look at green space and urbanity. And there does appear to be a relationship between green space, natural environments, and better health outcomes in multiple domains across a population level. And we do see a reasonably consistent increase in mental health issues in urban environments. But, and I really can't emphasize this enough, we have to always take into account socioeconomic inequality when we're looking at this material, because socioeconomic inequality and environmental inequality are so deeply entwined. If you were to think of a city, I've posted a picture on the top left of the screen of Jakarta, which is a city which has massive population or pollution issues. It's considered to be one of the most polluted cities in the world. And if we were to imagine a city which is complex urban environment, but there are areas of suburbs which are green and leafy and have rivers running through them, we might expect to find better health outcomes in that area compared to an industrial or post-industrial area with lots of pollution and very little green space. But how do the socioeconomic factors relate to that? Which area is going to be gentrified first, when we kind of expect the wealthier people to move into the area with the more natural benefits? Does that skew how we understand the environmental impacts on health? How do pollution, noise, disease, crime, how do all these things interact? And that means that while there are these broad trends towards urban environments having more higher rates of mental health issues, we have to be very nuanced in how we unpack and understand that, because it's very easy to oversimplify and not really take into account all these factors. So when we're coming to nature therapy, let's talk a little bit about some of the theoretical underpinnings of it. There are three classic ones in the literature and two which I think we should consider a little bit more. The first one is attention restoration theory, and this is to do with cognitive loading. It's a cognitive psychological model that in urban environments we're constantly being bombarded with information that we haven't necessarily evolved to process. So that could be anything from living amongst dense populations to the information that we're getting from light, advertising. The entire physical environment of the city overloads our senses a little bit, and simply going out into a natural space removes a lot of those cognitive loads, and we just get a slightly restored attention and ability to connect with what's around us in a more present way. So there's a little bit of an overlap there with mindfulness-based ideas. The second one is stress reduction theory. It's quite related to the first, and this is more to do with other environmental stresses like noise or pollution, the kind of factors that are impacting our neurological system, our immune system, our endocrinological system. And again, moving from an area where there are a lot of stresses on that system to an area where there are decreased stresses, we have a reduction in overall stress in all our body's communicative systems. The third one is one I'm going to talk about a little bit more in depth because, frankly, it's most fun. The biophilia hypothesis is, though he didn't come up with the term, it's credited to the biologist E.O. Wilson. He's a fantastic writer, and I would encourage everyone to read the book Biophilia if you can. Biophilia is the idea that humans are attracted to life and to lifelike processes, that it's an innate attraction. And this is something that we developed in our evolutionary progression and is very fundamental to who we are as human beings. There are some issues with it. There are some selectivity in terms of which physical environments Wilson thought we actually evolved in. There's some reductionism in it. There's a little bit of overlooking some complexity. But he also talks about something which I think people don't address, in that some of our attraction towards life and nature and lifelike processes is based a little bit on fear. And he has this beautiful chapter talking about how the biophilia of human relationships with snakes, and that snakes are such profound symbols for us, and that even as small children, we're quite fascinated by those symbols until we learn to associate them with danger. And he talks about the kind of, I can't remember his exact phrasing, but he used something like the sublime horror. And I think it's an absolutely beautiful way of talking about human relationships with nature. And it's both fascinating and deep, but it isn't overly romanticized. There are tensions there as well. In more modern research, I think we can talk about nature therapy with respect to the biopsychosocial model. We all know as musculoskeletal clinicians that the biopsychosocial model has become the dominant paradigm in research. The interactions between biological processes, sociological factors, psychological processes are key to both health and to understanding the complexity and the individuality of disease. And I'd argue that the environment could be considered a contextual factor, which is a major influence on the biopsychosocial model. Lastly, the inactive ecological model. This is a model which is very, very new in terms of its implementation into research. And if anyone wants more details, I'd recommend reading up Peter Stilwell and Sabrina Connick's work. This is a way of moving beyond the body-mind dichotomy. It's looking at how the mind is constantly interacting with the whole body, which is constantly interacting with the whole environment. And therefore, we can't really separate any one of those components out. The whole thing is this incredibly dynamic interaction. And of course, in that context, the environment, our local ecological system offers us opportunities to explore movement, to understand our bodies. It reflects and shows how we think. And I'm not going to say too much more about it because, frankly, a lot of the literature is really complex and I'm still trying to get my head around it. But those two authors have written some lovely papers, which I'd recommend people have a look at. So One specific form of nature therapy is Shinrin Yoku, or forest bathing. And this is, though it's quite novel, it was developed in Japan in the 1980s. This is something which has garnered a lot of public attention, and certainly there have been innumerable public articles about this in newspapers, especially over the course of the pandemic, when people had their physical space restricted by lockdown measures. And it involves sitting or walking slowly, generally, in a forested area whilst paying attention to the multisensory experience. So it is a multisensory phenomenon. We're looking at the visual stimulus, the sounds, the smells, the textures, the feel of the ground under our feet, maybe the feel of tree bark or moss. And again, there's a little bit of an overlap with ideas about mindfulness here. The idea of really coming into the present moment and soaking up the environment in all its complexity and all its beauty, or as Wilson would say, even some of its sublime horror. Some research was done on this in the 1990s, and what they were looking at was when people spend time in forested environments in this kind of meditative or observant frame. They were looking at stress biomarkers, blood pressure, serum glucose, some general health metrics. A lot of those studies were very, very small. But something that's come up frequently is the idea that it might be useful to deal with depression. Let's see. And as we know, depression and pain are so deeply entwined in the biopsychosocial model that these phenomena interact in a myriad of ways, and depression is associated with fear avoidance and catastrophizing, and it's a strong predictor of someone who's dealing with pain or injury getting to a state of chronic pain, persistent pain. So a lot of the research is focused now on dealing with these issues. How do we deal with them clinically? Are they within our scope of practice? Do we need to refer people out to psychological management? Or are there self-management strategies for depression which we can integrate within our scope of practice with patients? So could Shinrin Yoku be useful for managing depression? And if so, could that be relevant for an evidence-based musculoskeletal paradigm where we're looking at self-supporting measures and promoting health through self-supporting measures? So I published a paper earlier this year with my colleagues Simon Devitt and Payal Sood, and we published an integrative view of the research on Shinrin Yoku and looking at what are the effects on depression, with a secondary aim of looking at what are the effects on various physiological markers and seeing if there was anything we could infer from the literature which would inform musculoskeletal practice. The criteria we were looking at were adults with or without depression. In terms of the intervention, we were trying to just look at forest exposure as much as possible, because obviously exercise will have its own independent effects on mental health issues and biochemical markers and such. And we were looking at primarily changes in self-assessed measures of depression, changes in physiological metrics as a second one. And when we had gone through all our databases and such, we eventually came out with 13 studies, 2 of which were systematic reviews, 5 randomized control trials, and 6 randomized crossover studies. Unfortunately, we didn't find any qualitative literature which met our inclusion criteria, which is a real shame, because there's a lot of aspects of this which needs to be explored through qualitative research. When we had the research, we used critical assessment skills program frameworks to analyze those papers, and they weren't great. When we'd actually looked at the risks of bias and some of the methodological issues, we scored each paper on a percentage framework based on its CASP results, and the average percentage quality was about 55%. So it was low, and I think if you were a cardiologist, you'd probably have your cutoff for quality percent set up around 85, 90%. But when we're dealing with a new field, sometimes it's useful to lower the barriers a little bit just to see what's out there. We always say inevitably in every paper more research is needed, but sometimes we actually have to go, well, what kind of research? Or maybe some research isn't needed. And that was what we found. So in terms of our findings in relation to depression, of the papers that we looked at, all the studies except one showed small but statistically significant reductions in self-assessed measures of depression. The only one that didn't, interestingly, showed a reduction in anxiety. So, there's still something there, and there was also some physiological changes there which were useful. There was decreased heart rate. But there's a lot of issues with this research. There are many, many sources of bias. Blinding is one of them. How do you blind someone to a physical environment interaction? There was one study that tried to obscure visual references by putting people in a shelter or in a hide, but that was also a shelter and a hide in the middle of a forest. So there's going to be a certain amount of expectation bias there, and there's still other sensory input that's coming in. A lot of sample size variation, and something we need to consider, and we'll come back to, is whether that increases or decreases its generalizability. Lots of ranging study designs and different metrics used, so it's very difficult to do any meta-analysis. And then something we need to think about is how specific can an environmental interaction be, because a forest is a dynamic system. It's constantly in the process of change. The same area of forest in 2 days are going to be expressing a wide variety of different phenomena. Could the humidity on a given day provoke a different therapeutic interaction? What if there are insects? Would your experience in a tropical forest be the same as one in a temperate forest? Would your experience at night be the same as during the day? All these things are constantly changing, and it's just somewhat of an illusion that we have culturally that ecosystems are sort of fixed, whereas they're in an internal process of change. And how might that affect things? On a practical level, a lot of the studies which used crossover methodologies, so normally you have randomized control trials and you've got your intervention group and your control group. With crossover studies, you'll split your participants into 2 groups, and each will do the intervention and the control. And that will be useful in terms of reducing some of the within and between group differences that can cause statistical errors. But if you're doing a crossover trial, you need to know what your washout period is. How long does the intervention last for? This is something Dave Nichols was talking about last night. If we're talking about a drug like aspirin, we have a very good idea of the half-life of that. How long does it last in your system? Well, we can measure it in hours. How long does a natural experience affect you for? Does that affect that when you do your control, you go for a walk in an urban environment? Are your memories different? Are your emotional attachments different? If the washout period is very, very long, how do you force people not to interact with nature? This is an aspect of the research which I think we could probably get rid of. Of course, with depressive findings and self-assessment, we have self-assessment bias. People will report kind of what they think they should report. Physiological findings do eliminate that self-assessment bias a little bit. But what we do see in the research is that when people have exposure to natural environments like forests in this research, we do see reductions in things like cytokines and various biomarkers of oxidative stress. We see decreases in heart rate. We see increases in heart rate variability, which is all generally indicative that someone is moving out of a stress state. So the physiological findings, we could probably take with a little bit more. There are 1 or 2 little biases that are eliminated with those, and we can take those a little bit more solidly. The psychological findings, even though I think they're useful, we do have to take with a pinch of salt. So one of the limitations of the study was it was just me doing the quality review of papers. So I have my biases. It's not perfect. You definitely need collaborative research in this regard when you're evaluating research quality. I speak English. I have a couple of phrases of other languages, but I do not have the capacity to evaluate other research in other languages. And this is an area where we do need multinational collaboration. There were a lot of papers that were published in Korean, for instance, and unless you speak or read Korean, it's very, very difficult to infer what they were doing. On a practical level, also the methodological quality of the papers we established post hoc. We didn't have a cutoff for what quality would be until we'd actually gathered the papers and looked at them. So basically, when we're talking a little bit about some of the methodological qualities, the big underlying theoretical issues that we're dealing with a complex intervention, that nature is, and natural environments like forests have so many potential active ingredients, and we don't know what they are. We do know that there's studies about the visual effects of natural environments on people. So even paintings or photographs. We do know that scent can play a role. Volatile organic compounds like alpha-pinene can have a profound effect on reducing heart rate in people in some experiments. We do know that textures and touch can have an effect, but all of these things are all happening at once. So just like many other aspects of the physical therapies, physiotherapy, osteopathy, we are dealing with a complex intervention. And what comes with that is a degree of uncertainty about how things actually work. We're also dealing with the complexity of depression, which is so individual. We're dealing with the complexity of socioeconomic factors, as we mentioned earlier. We're dealing with a lot of variability. So the idea, which I reject, is that at some point someone will publish a paper that says, yes, going into a forest for 30 minutes twice a week reduces your depression by 40%. We're never going to have that. We have to appreciate that engagement with nature is an incredibly rich and profound experience, but we're never, ever going to be able to quite grasp it in a biomedical model. So while the results, while this research is flawed and there are a lot of problems with it, we also have to acknowledge that the best we can get are tendencies and how those tendencies might apply to any one given individual. So in terms of how we actually apply this, I very rarely talk about nature therapies prescriptively with patients. I tend to have, once we've established somewhat of a rapport, I will ask about nature-based values and see if this is something that people are amenable to. How important is engaging with nature for a given individual? If someone is open to these kind of things, even in a sense of curiosity, then perhaps we can talk about what options are available for someone, whether that's engaging in meditative practice in the forest or walking along blue space. But all these applications have to be patient-centered rather than a dogmatic top-down, you should spend 30 minutes in this environment, go away and see me next week kind of approach. Now, moving on from the specifics of the research, there are some broader questions like the relationship with nature is a deeply personal and cultural thing. And can we or should we medicalize that? That's a question that really I think we need to ask is, are we turning this into a very reductive thing rather than an explorative opportunity for someone to engage with the natural world? Something else that comes up is eco-anxiety. What can heal can harm. And I'm sure that many of the people participating in this festival today or across these few days are very deeply aware of eco-anxiety and deep worry about ecosystems and about climate. And if we have someone who's potentially sensitive, depressed, feeling who's suffering, could we potentially be opening the door for more suffering by talking about nature-based issues? I don't have a clear answer here. I just think that this is an important aspect to discuss. A key issue that comes up in a lot of research is inequality of access to nature. So how do we deal with transport or access inequities? And this is going to vary very much country to country, region to region. And I think that's a question that we all need to ask ourselves in terms of, if we are working with nature-based therapies, what are the realities of life in the communities we live and work in? The other thing that I mentioned previously is nature-based prescriptions or social prescribing. I sometimes worry it's a bit top-down rather than patient-centered and explorative, and I don't That's not really how I want to interact with patients. And broader questions of socioeconomic inequality underpin all this stuff, as well as political factors like land ownership and enclosure. So, for instance, there's many incredible natural sites in the world where native populations will not be able to access them, that they are prioritized for Western tourists. That's probably less of an issue in Europe itself, but it is something I think we need to consider. We also need to consider something which I don't think happens a lot in this literature, which is ecological considerations. When we're talking about using areas like forests, we're talking about the benefits of us being there. But ecosystems are really, really highly stressed. And while climate change is at the forefront of most people's thinking in terms of environmentalism, biodiversity and the integrity of remaining ecosystems is something that we absolutely need to consider, because ecosystems, when they work well, they suck out a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. And currently, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, only about 25% of land is sufficiently unimpacted that ecological and evolutionary processes still operate with minimal human intervention. Some would argue that that figure is a little bit high. So if we're talking about increasing access to natural systems, what systems are we potentially increasing pressure on? How do we reconcile that? How do we blend both worlds? And I think if we are serious about nature therapies, we need to discuss how we balance our needs for nature access with nature's need for recovery. That is not something I can make a general statement on. Again, that's going to be very local. It's going to require a lot of local and collaborative and community-based thinking, and it's going to involve improving access to nature. It's going to involve expanding and protecting natural areas. And this is something that I feel extremely strongly about. I'm a member of a couple of non-governmental organizations which work specifically to do this. And I'd recommend all of us look at what organizations are working in our localities, in our communities, in our adjacent ecosystems that are looking to protect and expand. How can we connect and collaborate with them? So those are some of the questions that I've got at the end of my research. I just want to thank, I know he's passed on to the next meeting, Philippe. He's been really, really kind in letting me join and participate in this festival. The EPA executive also want to really grateful for them, both for organizing and running this, and then for letting a real diversity of people take place. My co-authors, who are fantastic, and of course, as all of us know, it's our patients who make us. So those who trust me with helping them with their problems, it's an incredible job. So a couple of pages of references here. If anyone wants the slides, please just email me. I'm going to come up to the title slide in a second. But for the moment, I'm really interested in your thoughts, your questions, what you'd like to ask. So I'm just going to exit out of this and go to the title slide, and my email's there. Pop me an email if anyone wants the slides, okay? I'm stopping sharing. So, any thoughts, questions? If you want to put up your hand or just join in.
I've got a question.
Yeah, please.
You've been talking about the I don't know how to call it in English, but it's difficult. The idea of taking money for forest therapy interventions. You know, this is like also an ethic question that I'm considering at the moment, to ask myself, like, you've been talking about medicalizing a certain forest therapy walks or something like this. Do you have any statement in the concern of like taking money out of it, because I realized that there are many profit organizations like popping up like plants and trying to develop like new concepts of getting money for forest therapy walks and for meditative walks and stuff.
Okay. Well, look, we all have to eat. And I don't think I can make an authentic statement to say it's wrong to earn money. I mean, is it wrong for me to earn money when I'm helping someone with low back pain? It's the same question. I'm sure. So that's not something I feel like I can necessarily state with any degree of authority. It's something you have to square with your own values and beliefs. The reason I said that I was not taking any money from this was just so that I could state this research. It's something that I'm very interested in, but I don't have any financial incentive to skew the research one way or another, or to skew my interpretations of it.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. Question in the chat here. You or anyone here see the research and benefits bringing nature into indoor places, into clinics, hospitals? If you do this already in your practice already, yeah, that's a really great question. So yeah, there is definite research on improving health outcomes in hospitals with nature-based designs. So there's a body of landscape architecture which has looked into that. Improved outcomes have included like shorter hospital stays, people recover better inflammatory markers, or reduced inflammatory markers. So yeah, that is something. It's not. I've skim read that research. I don't know it in depth, but there is stuff out there I'd encourage people to read. Any other thoughts or questions? Oh yeah, Marguerite.
Yes, I think this is such an interesting subject, and it was a very nice presentation you gave. I was wondering if you have any experience in like treating patients outside and giving like nature therapy, and if you could say a bit like about just your experience and the patients, how they react to it.
Yeah, so this is something I've done in a relatively informal way. So done more with members of my community rather than patients per se. And it's a really great opportunity to explore the difference between showing and telling. Because one of the things I really like about nature therapies, and one of the questions I'd have about, we need to make sure, I think, that this doesn't evolve into guru food, into a paradigm where gurus kind of say, this is the way to interact, is that I've taken people out and shown them, oh, you know, this is this natural space, or maybe, you know, what's that bird? Oh, what's that moss? What's that mushroom? What's that animal? And responded in that way where people can connect in a deeper level with natural environments. But it's really lovely because you're basically just trying to create a safe opportunity for people to become kids again, and to engage in that really felt sense that there is wonder in this world. So it's fantastic. It's something I have done. It's something I intend to do a lot more of. And the skills required to do that are first aid and logistics.
Sounds very nice, and I think that it will be very good for the patients as well to have these experiences.
Any other questions? Let's see. Hey, Annette.
Hi, Richard. How are you doing?
Good.
Quick question. I hope that's not going to be a silly one. Are you planning to do any more research on your paper that you very good in your dissertation, by the way, absolutely amazing results. Are you planning to do any more research on this? So you get to look at some funding and see what you can do anything further?
Short answer, yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, I definitely think this is something which requires a lot more work, but it requires a very different kind of research. Like, I think a lot of the research to date has been very, very biomedical, and they are looking at dose response curves basically. And when people, for me, that's as absurd as saying, what is the optimal dose of time to spend with someone you love? Like, well, it's a relationship. It's not an interaction. And it's about cultivating, facilitating those kind of relationships. So I do have a couple of irons in the fire with some NGOs that I'm working on, where I'm trying to actually help develop the health aspects of their rewilding or ecological restoration policy. So that wouldn't be academic publication, but hopefully we'll get some stuff out of that. I'm definitely open to collaborating with any researchers who are interested in exploring these issues further, though.
Well, if it's any consolation, the last time I had a bit of a walk through the centre of London, if anyone knows the city of London, it's quite well. There's Green Park, and there's a bit in Canary Wharf specifically, if I could say it correctly. There is actually a floating garden. I came across it. I went, oh my goodness! So for Canary Wharf to put that sort of money into a floating garden on the water above the Elizabeth line, which is I thought, oh my goodness. And it's to help, of course, the City of London guys who want to step away, guys and girls, of course, who want to step away from a very stressful job. I used to work in that area quite a lot myself. To walk through, you had different walks, a 1 minute walk, a 5 minute walk, or a 10 minute walk through a floating garden. So if there wasn't good, decent research, nobody would be investing that type of money into a floating garden in London. So that's maybe something you could look into there as well. That I just found it a few weeks ago. I was in London and I went, oh my goodness, a floating garden in the middle of London, what just happened? So yeah, and very interesting plants there, and they had lots of different ways, and I thought it was a very nice relaxing space for people who are particularly stressful jobs in an urban environment to get a bit to see something more green. So there's definitely something in it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just saw, Philippe, thanks for live referencing some of the points in the
being a good assistant here, Richard.
Appreciate that. Any other questions or Roxanne, yeah.
Hi, Richard. Hi, everyone. Thanks for a lovely presentation. I've got I don't know if it's so much a question as more of a reflection of sorts, but I was writing, I'm a student at the moment, physio student, and I was writing a paper on this topic recently. And I came across some research from Sweden where they were looking at, specifically from the perspective of the attention restoration theory. They were looking at what if people have different preferences in terms of what they like what if people like to be in natural environments, if that's their preferred kind of environment, versus if they like to be in urban environments. Does that change biomarkers in response to being in nature? And they found that it was preference dependent, whether people had a kind of quote unquote positive effect from being in nature on certain biomarkers like blood pressure, etc. And that made me really curious, because I guess I have some sort of bias, or some sort of belief around that nature is healing for everyone. And I do believe that, but it also raised some questions around what is it that makes people prefer different environments, and why would people not prefer a natural environment, etc., etc. And I was just wondering if you've got any thoughts, reflections, ideas, or anything around that.
Yeah, Roxanne, I think you made a really, really important point here, and I really appreciate that contribution. The analogy that I'd go back to is that it's a relationship, and your individual. There are actually psychological measures in terms of nature effectiveness, different kinds of psychological traits which indicate how much someone is likely to have a pro-nature effectiveness. I can't remember the specific metric, but I will email it to you later because I do have something at home which might be relevant for you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the example I would use is if you had someone who had an absolutely awful phobia of insects, and these people exist, I mean, total panic attack, would you take that person into a forested environment? Yeah, no. And some people will have a real identity within urban environments. There's lots of cultural, psychological reasons for that. And this is why I'm very clear about, and I tried to emphasize in this talk several times, a very important point for me is that it's not a hierarchical thing. I'm never telling someone you need to go and spend time in nature so much as what are you open to? What motivates you? What do you love? And from a day-to-day perspective, I'm dealing with pain and injury in my clinic. And the majority cultural paradigm of pain and injury has kind of related to sport because most of the research and studies are done on young athletes, right? Whereas I'm more interested in people who are weirdos like myself. And in terms of what really, really motivates or what are someone's intrinsic values? And if someone is open to nature, then like, okay, well, then this is something that's worth discussing. It's not a trivial point. This is a meaningful aspect of who you are in this world.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's super interesting. And I think, yeah, I think there's more, exploration there for me personally, because I think what happened when I came across this research was that it upset me somehow because it was, it was contradictory to my beliefs or my belief system. And so I think there is something interesting there to explore, basically. And yeah.
But also, like, when you're trying to be an evidence-based practitioner, one of the hardest things is when you read something that clashes with your own biases. And it's not a comfortable thing, but when you do it and you come through it, you're better able to respect the diversity of humanity that's going to come before you. So, like, I've felt that discomfort so many times that I can only say my heart goes out to you. It doesn't get easier, but you get better at handling it.
Yes. Great. Thank you.
Philly? Yeah, I'm game. So we've got a few minutes left. Any other final questions, thoughts, or ideas that people have noticed in the last hour? So I'm going to say probably no. Look, everyone who came along and spent time in this chat today, I'm really, really grateful. The questions were absolutely brilliant. I'm so just happy and delighted that people felt that this weird little talk was something that they found valuable. If anyone has any further questions or wants to talk to me, wants a copy of the paper, or wants to explore any aspects of the research that was done, you can pop me an email. I will just add my email to the chat. And I really hope that people get to explore this festival. There are just some so incredible the kind of people that are participating, and Philippe, you guys have just done an amazing job. So it's really exciting to think about what comes next.
if I can just follow up on that, I really want to encourage everyone to visit as many of the upcoming sessions as possible. There's still so much good stuff coming. There's also a lot of stuff that will continue to touch on nature-based therapies related stuff, but also presentations taking you to other places of the link between environment, health, and society, and physio and osteo, and you name it. So please do attend as many sessions as you can. There's a lot of really good stuff still coming. And then clearly we have to have some kind of nature-based something workshop next year. Where we go into real depth.
Pick the place, I'll be there.
Yeah.
So thanks everyone. I'll see you, many of you, across the next couple of days.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank
You're welcome, guys.
you so much, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much.
Now I need to stop recording.